I know, you're all shocked that I really enjoyed a book that's by a female author who primarily wrote in the 1990s. It's surprising. Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, we are going to be talking about Arrows of the Queen by Mercedes Lackey, which is the first book in the Valdemar series. Apparently, we don't want to focus on this here. I actually read this out of an omnibus version I got from the library, but I happened to find this mass market paperback at my half-price book, so I'm like, cool, now I have a copy of myself. But this is the first book of Valdemar. It was published in the late 80s, and it does feel a little bit more 80s than 90s, which somebody did tell me on my video here, which is where, the classifications aren't perfect by any means. But this is a book that I did quite enjoy. And the biggest thing for me, which I don't know how good of a description this is, but it just kind of started out charming, despite the fairly dark material here. This is a book that leans a little bit younger reading, but it's in that sort of 80s style where it has, our main character starts the book, they're 13. So you have some of that younger audience type of things, but it's also not shying away from heavy topics. It's not doing a lot of the later kind of YA tropes that tend to really irritate me. A lot of those came a little bit later, and it just is written in a way that doesn't ever feel condescending to the reader, and kind of makes it have that all ages type of feel. Ultimately, I found myself really enjoying this. This was one of, especially toward the beginning, one of my favorite things that I was just enjoying the most reading this month. And this was a really good reading month, I'll say, when I was reading this as well, because I enjoyed pretty much everything that I've read. So this one just really was standing out and has that kind of classic feel that I really enjoy, and does a lot of great things with the sort of world building on the fly. So I should talk a little bit more about the book, I suppose, because that's what one does in a book review. But this is about a character called Talia, and she is a holder folk, so lives on a holding that's sort of like the border of the land, and it makes it sound sort of almost like a type of like commune thing, where it's very, very patriarchal, and women are just expected to become wives, whether a first wife or an underwife, to people, and have very, very little control. And Talia is just looks to try to read as an escape, even though reading is kind of looked down upon, and she doesn't have a lot of opportunities. And has dreams of one day becoming a herald, even though she knows that that's never going to happen. It would be impossible. But lo and behold, she ends up being chosen to be a herald, and the companion, which the companions are like magical horses, sort of, basically here. You can see why this would probably do very well with younger girls, in a lot of ways, probably. But I feel like relating to a character who just wants to escape and read as a kid, that's a trope that often works for me, because that was just very real for me. But she is chosen, and so that sounds like that's gonna go like, oh yeah, very stereotypical. But again, it's the writing, which is quite good, and the way that it's written, that I think really makes it just not feel like it's over the top tropey, because the main character, Talia, like, her life is pretty bleak. She's 13, and they're like, well, we're getting ready to marry you off, doesn't matter, and her only choices are get married off and just hope it's not to somebody who's cruel and abusive, or if she's sent to be like the temple, she'll never be allowed to like speak or out of like this tiny little area, or ever again, and like has no hopes, and has all of these dreams, and then is chosen. And after being chosen by Harold, she doesn't understand it, and is just afraid that she's going to get in trouble, and is just absolutely terrified. And so, coming from that sort of character who really takes a while to come into their own, it's very easy to root for the character and to follow the character. And so I enjoyed, even though we're starting with a younger character, I was enjoying it. And the kind of the writing style, like I said, despite that, it's not over the top dark or grim. It's very, real, that type of thing. And it's something that you've certainly seen in parts of the world and used to be somewhat common in some areas. So it's that type of stuff. It's very real, but it's not over the top dark, but it's also not over the top whimsical. It's this kind of weird mix of both that just works. You have the whimsy, you also have the dark reality, and it just really, really works. And following this character as they try to come into their own, and finding out that they are apparently supposed to be the queen's own, and specifically they're supposed to rehabilitate a very bratty young princess, so that she can maybe one day become the heir. So I'll talk a little bit more about the character and the plot and some of the things that happen there as well. But I do want to touch on the world building I mentioned that happens sort of on the fly in a way that, again, I really, really appreciate. I think on the fly world building, which what I mean by that is you have the story, you're not stopping to exposit or to give info dumps. You learn about the world as you go. So oftentimes it's easier when you have a character who's learning things, but also like the character is, she's read a lot of tales, so there'll be times where she's having a conversation, she does actually already know something, and we're like, oh yeah, I know it's about this story, but so you kind of learn things like that, and it's difficult to balance, and I've seen people do it really well and other people not so well, because if it feels like you're stopping to the story to do it, and then that's where people start to complain about info dumps. But Mercedes Lackey does a really great job here about just, you learn about the world. We already learned about like the holding the border, that this is a more dangerous area, and that's where the population, there are so few men because they're fighting when raids are happening. We see our character traveling. We learned about the Collegium with the heralds. We learned a lot about the heralds as she's learning to become one. We start learning about the political situation, all these types of things. So we learn all of these things, and the world feels incredibly rich because we have these legends, and we have the more contemporary versions, the older ones, the tales, and we're learning about all of these different things, but it happens very organically, and so that's the kind of world building that just, I want to read more. I'm very quickly, hopefully, going to be reading the next two, and I'm excited because there are a ton of books that take place in this world over different time frames. This is actually, there are, I know, books that take place chronologically well before this as well, so there's earlier, later, but that's the kind of thing that just makes you want to dive into a world, and so I think works really, really well. Going back then to the character and kind of some of the plot. So I will say I was really enjoying this in the beginning for the first pretty big chunk. And then there was some spot like in the second third maybe where I was a little less into it, although I did enjoy the ending. And there was no point I wasn't enjoying. But what I will say, this does have some of these sort of, like I said, younger reading type of things. The idea is the young characters being in a situation where they have to try and figure out and solve something themselves and not involve the adults or the older characters, which is a trope that can irritate me very easily. Didn't really hear. There's also like a tiny bit of sort of like romance, but I actually really liked the handling of the way that was done. And there's just the character kind of learning, growing up, learning to be a herald, learning these other things. So there were some parts there that felt just a little bit more on the younger reading side. But again, I feel like even then, the way it's handled, it never felt condescending to the reader. It just was some of those elements or tropes are just things I like reading about a little bit less. But we deal with several topics, and the way it kind of reminded me almost of is the Abhorsen Chronicles by Garth Nix, which was also younger reading, but quite dark. That goes, I don't know, they probably actually have a similar level of like dealing with serious and darker topics at points, but doing it well and not in a condescending way. But so we deal with that, with different things like with death and loss and abuse and all kinds of things like that too. And also with just talking about empathy and dealing with things like that. And so there's a lot of these great themes and types of topics that are explored, but in a really good way and a really constructive way. And again, that doesn't feel like I'm being talked down to, which when I'm reading a book that's younger reading, the worst thing you can do is talk down to me, because that means as an adult, I guess I shouldn't be reading it if you're going to do that. So you could write something that's for a younger audience, but it's not only for a younger audience. There's a lot of authors that have done a great job, and that's what this kind of feels like to me. I do think some of the later ones too might be a little bit less for that younger reading, but it is kind of more the all ages type of thing. And the character does a lot of growing as well, so they don't just stay super young, but even like they're a very like repressed 13 as well, so they don't necessarily feel that way in general. So there were a few things that I felt like were just like a little bit tropey, and I feel like that's to be expected, especially with a big series like this. You're gonna have some of those things, and every series has some tropes. It just depends which ones you like. But the fact that this has technically, like, it's not so much a school trope, even though she's going to the Collegium to learn. It still technically has some of those other things that tend to not work that well for me. The fact that I still really enjoy this, I think, speaks highly of the writing and just how technically well done it is. I will say, I think, too, that the idea of the kind of, like, having to handle things themselves is the people, there's a talk, this isn't a spoiler, but there's a line mentioned about, that how they're taking away these people's childhood, and somebody says, well, that's heralds, it's all of us, none of us really have a childhood, because you find out heralds are usually chosen very young, and they're chosen by the companion will go out and find who they're going to sort of like bond with, and that's how they choose the new heralds. And so they're picked kind of young, and then they're brought in, they're trained up to be heralds, which is not some necessarily glorious job. They, do things like bring messages with, be arbiters of justice, but they also have a lot of danger. And well, most of them end up dying young or fighting, and whether it's battles or just trying to deliver dangerous messages, things like that. And so that's sort of the theme, is that we're following younger characters, and there's some of that moments, but it's like somebody trying to grow up while also having to deal with all these really serious topics. And I think it does toe the line well, and it doesn't get to the point where we just like, oh my gosh, everything's terrible because we didn't get help. It's handled better than that, I think, in a somewhat realistic way. And so it just feels it never feels like it's forced or over the top with that type of thing. And the world that's set up, I think, as well, is just really, really fascinating. So overall, I really enjoyed this. This was, like I said, one of my highlights of the month. I did give it 4 stars because, again, I think it's really good, and I could see a lot of people absolutely loving this, especially if you are a reader who likes, you enjoy like YA or younger reading things. Like, check this out immediately, because this has a lot of that feel, but is done really, really well. But also, just if you like classic fantasy type of feel, you're okay with younger characters. You had that in a lot of the classic fantasies, where that was just kind of the following, the coming of age stories, that type of thing. That also, those elements are handled really well here and really, really well done. So this is one I definitely recommend to those. If you're more the modern fantasy reader, I don't know that you're going to like this as much, just because this has a lot of those classic elements, albeit well done. But it's just it's a really good book, and a world that, like I said, I really want to dive into more, so I cannot wait to continue. And I'm excited to have so much Valdemar to get to, although this does add another really long series to my list to get to, so there is that, but I'm still excited. But overall, those are my thoughts on Arrows of the Queen, the first book in the Heralds of Valdemar trilogy, and Valdemar as a whole. Let me know your thoughts on this if you have read it. Would love to hear from you as well. Also, if there are like highlights in this series, or just reading it chronologically, if you have thoughts on that, definitely let me know. So yeah, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, check the links in the description as always for the Patreon if you want to support what I do. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.